Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to the second Caribbean Conference on Corruption, Compliance, and Cybercrime. This is an exciting time for the region because we are facing so many challenges. And that is why the theme for this conference is ending poverty and driving growth, promoting good governance by curbing corruption, compliance, and cybercrime, money laundering and cybercrime. This panel will focus on drivers of corruption. And I'd like to say welcome to the almost 1,000 people who are joining us from all over the world. 1,000 people from 45 countries all over the world. We're grateful that you're able to join us for this session. We will hope to focus on looking at what really drives corruption in the Caribbean, what lessons we can learn about that from global experiences, what new global insights around corruption drivers, detection, and prevention we can identify and share with you. We're looking for new insights, new mechanisms and tools. We're looking to understand the historical, sociological, and all other perspectives on what drives corruption in the region, and new methods, etc. Joining us today for this discussion on this panel is Professor Trevor Munroe, Dr. Darran Newman, Dr. Dawn Coteau, and Mr. James Anderson. Each of these presenters have provided their bios to you and they're online. So in the interest of time, I will go directly to our discussion. What I'd also like to share with our audience is that for this session, you can post your questions online and they will be able to be answered by the panel. So I'd like to thank you presenters for joining us today as well. I will go straight into it by starting with Professor Munroe. Professor Munroe, what in your view, you would say are key to the perception and drives of corruption in the Caribbean? And tell us a bit about specific issues you believe you can focus on in explaining what drives corruption. Issues like the legislative framework, for instance, or the impact of prosecutions and whether or not wrongdoers are being imprisoned for corrupt acts. Please share with us.
Well, first of all, Toussant, I'm glad to be here, and I want to extend appreciations to the Caribbean Development Bank for having the second in the series, and hope that we will continue and not only talk, but our talk will lead to action, because action is very urgent. In that context, I also want to use the opportunity to pay a tribute to your recently retired President, Boyce, my friend, and to welcome our new leader, Jean Leon, who is also my friend. He stayed in Jamaica for some time, and we met and have a high regard for him. I would want to start by indicating that our conference is so very timely. For the first reason is that all Caribbean people, in the surveys that have been done, have a considerable concern with the issue of corruption, and therefore it is important that the bank takes up this issue. It's not just an international preoccupation, but that of all Caribbean people. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, 85%, in the Bahamas, 80%, Jamaica, 78%, Guyana, 59%, Barbados, 53%, and it goes on and on. Our people are concerned. And obviously, their perception is not drawn from heaven, but develops as a result of their own experiences on Earth in the various territories of our region. And in that context, our conference is so very timely because as we speak, the integrity anti-corruption framework in Jamaica is being strengthened. And this is an important part of the concern of our people, that the laws are inadequate, and where they are adequate, they are not enforced equally. I refer, of course, to the fact that the Jamaican Parliament is receiving today regulations to ensure that the appointment to public bodies and public boards which administer water supplies, road infrastructure, etc., that these are going to be less on the basis of political connections, on the basis of cronyism, on the basis of nepotism, which has been the case for decades. And it is largely that appointment of persons without the necessary levels of competence, skill, and for reasons largely of political connection that has resulted in a tremendous loss to Jamaica and the Jamaican people in respect of the revenue available, the services provided in critical areas. So much so that the best estimate of the loss to Jamaica's GDP is in the region of 5% or 100 billion Jamaican dollars. When we consider that the entire budget of Jamaica's Ministry of National Security is 85 billion, you can imagine why it is a public concern that that level of corruption be cut so that better services in terms of security can be provided. So as of today, at the end of today, we're going to get a situation where persons who are going to be appointed to these critical positions are on the basis of a database of competence and of skill and of relevant experience. And this arises from the dynamics of corruption and anti-corruption in the Caribbean, which I hope we'll talk about some more later in the panel, whereby civil society plays a critical role in advocacy in relation to strengthening the legal framework, getting rid of loopholes, which we can also talk about, and in conjunction with our international partners in this particular instance, the International Monetary Fund, from as long as 2019, said to Jamaica, look, you need to do better, you need to ensure that your public words are run on the basis of competence. And thirdly, of course, not often recognized by civil society, there are persons in the political class who are of integrity. And it's important to identify those individuals, to be able to form implicit alliances with them, partnership with them, to deal with the corrupt, who often sit side by side in cabinets, sit side by side in parliament, and sit side by side on these various boards. And this is an issue I want to speak about a little more as we will have some more time, and I don't want to take up too much in my introductory remarks. But a timely conference, timely in terms of the public perception, timely in terms of what's happening in Jamaica, timely in terms of what needs to happen in the rest of our region, where we have so many institutions, relatively robust compared to other regions. We have 10 integrity commissions across the Caribbean. So why then are our people so concerned that whereas we have these 10 integrity commissions and so many other bodies, it does not seem to be impacting their perception and the reality of corruption which they face in everyday life, the consequences for them in relation to services that are provided. So I'll pause there, and again, thank you for the invitation, and hopefully I look forward to a robust discussion.
So thank you very much for that. I know that we have a large percentage of the audience from the private sector, from the student population, as well as government officials. And I think what you have just said is perhaps our first lesson from this panel, even during your intro. The first takeaway, particularly for those students who are listening, because how do you build public integrity and public trust? It's by institutionalizing mechanisms that will do that. So register of for skill and competence in being able to appoint public officials is the first key takeaway. Before I go to Dr. Darran Newman, I would like to say that we see the questions coming in from the audience, including one that we will pose later to Dr. Newman, the very first of which has to do with what actions can regional and international lending agencies like CDB and the World Bank and so on take. But we'll pose those questions later. First, I'd like to ask Dr. Darran Newman, tell us, what are your perspectives and views and insights on the whole idea of what drives corruption in the Caribbean? Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Boyce. And I just want to say it's indeed a pleasure to be part of an esteemed panel again at this second conference that we're having. Really very, very pleased. I just want to pick up from where Professor Munroe ended when he said, why with all these integrity commissions established and then functioning, why are people still so concerned about corrupt practices, corrupt behavior in our region, in the Caribbean and beyond? And I think, well, how many times do we hear people say it's because corrupt behavior is deeply rooted in our culture? And I think the drivers, my view is that the drivers of corruption, a lot of them are behavioral drivers of corruption. You have to look at behaviors. That forces you, therefore, to look closer at social norms and the underlying norms which fuel a lot of our behavior, which we carry over, generation by generation. And by social norms, I'm talking about shared standards of behavior, which are widely accepted by a group, a community, or even a country. And by taking that kind of a lens, you therefore want to understand more some of the actions that you see in society. Like we see things around vote buying. We have things around questionable contracts being issued. There is now more focus on sextortion, and there's also bribery. These things are seen, people say they're part of our culture, so they're fueling behavior. But then what do we do about that? How do we come around to change corrupt practices? So from a sociological perspective, it is very important for you to understand some of these underlying social norms and how norms can change. I think it's Terence Farrell from Trinidad and Tobago said that culture is not DNA. We can change social norms, and that can be done through, I will talk more later about that when we come to methods and when we talk a bit more about prevention. But I just, in this opening question, wanted to put the social norms perspective on the table. And I want to highlight the 3 Ts, which we see appearing repeatedly in our society, and they surround corruption. The first one, tolerance. Tolerance, not speaking out sometimes, many times, and the citizen-led action is very critical, and we'll come closer to that when we speak on, again, prevention and methods. The second one is trivialization. Sometimes we push things under the carpet, or by trivializing a particular action, we are kind of diminishing how important it is to good governance. And that's a form of bringing corruptive behavior into our sphere. And the third one is taboo. It's still not something we talk about, and it's unacceptable in some debates to talk about corruption in a very direct manner. So I wanted to put those 3. There are obviously very positive parts of our social norms. Globally, we are very positive, but we do have actions which do continue to contribute to relentless corruption practices. And that's why people will say, but it's part of our culture. What are we going to do about it? So we can talk some more about that later. For me, that I wanted to put the spotlight on the drivers, the behavioral drivers of corrupt practices.
Thank you. And I think that's an excellent way to look at it, because to the extent that behavioral drivers and other issues related to understanding how social norms operate as a driver of corruption in the region, sometimes it requires a really analytical understanding of how we've gotten there. And I believe that Dr. Dawn de Coteau is best placed to be able to provide some initial perspectives on that in her intro. Please, Dr. de Coteau, what are your perspectives and insights on what drives corruption in the region?
Thank you very much, Dr. Boyce, and thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to actually be here on this panel this afternoon, where I am, in the morning where you are. I think in regards to the drivers, I think in order to address that question, it's not a simple question to actually answer. And I think one of the things that we have to factor in, which is critical, is the Caribbean's 500-year history. You know, our slavery, colonization, and the trajectories up to modern day Caribbean is absolutely fundamental if we are to understand the drivers of corruption. Now, if you look at why it's important, and even though we will speak about hopefully the indices and some of the mechanisms that are in place to actually address corruption, but if you look at those various indices, for one, you will see that they are very much driven, yes, and devised by the West for the Caribbean basin. Yeah. Now, why I'm raising that at this earlier point is because the Caribbean and the Caribbean history is very much unique, as we know. I don't need to basically, refresh that here in this short 5 minutes, but as an introduction, but if we are really to meaningfully really want to address corruption in the Caribbean basin, we cannot put aside our 500-year history and just take a one-size-fits-all model. That is not possible. And even if we move on to our politics and the systems that we have, even in regards to the Westminster model of politics, by way of an example, the Westminster model of politics in the Caribbean basin in itself, present some very serious issues in regards to how we govern and how countries are governed, because what it leads to and what we can see today are you have governments, by way of example, in Grenada, where you do not have an opposition. You have a Westminster model of politics created to introduce check and balances, by way of an example. And you have today in Caribbean society, countries like Grenada where there are no check and balances because there is no opposition. So therefore you have, dare I say, leaders across the Caribbean who dare become dictators, and there are no check and balances. And therefore, if there are no check and balances, what that links to and what that creates an opportunity for across the Caribbean basin are poor practices and bad practices in regards to corruption. Now, I am just in this 5-minute introduction, just touching on and just giving some key issues that I think are fundamental, that if we are really to address corruption meaningfully within the Caribbean, we cannot just brush aside our histories. Because if we do that, because when you brush aside our histories, one of the things that you've got to understand in regards to how the Caribbean, Caribbean societies operate and how they function, you have family and kinship, you have the role of community cohesion, by way of an example. All of these are fundamentally important in looking at the relevance of what boss machine politics, by way of an example, and patronage and loyalty. A lot of, in the Caribbean, what we see is, the whole issue of, when we look at the political agenda, it's very much driven by patronage and loyalty and not specifically an ideology. And that is based on how, one of the reasons around that is because of how society functions. If we are poor and vulnerable, what's the priority? The priority has to be survival.
Thank you. And I think that is something we will definitely be able to come to in the later part, because I see we're filling up with questions, really solid questions. I'd like to thank the audience for sending through your questions. We will get to each one of them. And I already see 2 questions that I will be able to pose both to Dr. Newman and the next panelist I asked to speak, who's James Anderson, the lead governance specialist from the World Bank. James, just to cut to the chase, tell us, what are your perspectives, generally, global insights from a global insightful way, or globally insightful way, drives corruption? What lessons can we gain from a lot of the work that you have been doing at the World Bank and across your whole career in this area?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the introduction, and of course for the invitation. It's very nice to be here again. I enjoyed our conversation last year and learned a lot, and already have enjoyed the remarks of the previous panelists as well as the earlier sessions. So I'd like to start by echoing what others have said about how timely this discussion is. And I think not just timely for the Caribbean, but timely for the world. The issue of corruption is something that has been talked about and raised in different forms in different countries and internationally, especially over the past several decades. But in the past couple of years, there's been sort of a renewed attention to the problem of corruption and the harms that it causes. And the harms, as I see it, and as we see it at the World Bank, are much more than just the sort of cost of bribes or waste of money or illicit enrichment. The costs are found in the poor quality of services, poor quality of infrastructure. We already heard this morning, even in your president's speech, about climate change. All of these things, other things that we would like to address, are hampered when there is corruption that is not kept in check. And this is something that we find also when we do our surveys of stakeholders around the world. We ask a question about what is the reason that economic and social reforms fail, and a long list of different options are presented. But in many countries, the number one answer is corruption, that they think they're vested interests that have a stake in the status quo or a stake in going a certain direction, and that hampers those reforms. And we see that corruption also makes it harder to respond to crises. And we see this time and again, whether it's natural disasters or pandemics, when there is corruption, it slows things down and causes huge problems. Corruption can also fuel problems, fuel crises, particularly in fragile environments. We have an event tomorrow for International Anti-Corruption Day, focusing specifically on fragility and the role that the sort of self-reinforcing role that corruption and fragility play with each other, and what to do about that. The drivers, I have to echo what the other speakers have said. It's always a complicated question of what drives corruption. It does exist in every country, and over time it can be more rampant or more controlled. We usually try to focus on what we call institutions of public accountability mechanisms, because these are things that can be somewhat controlled. But they're also, in a way, technical approaches to corruption, which is often a much more complicated problem involving networks of politicians and businesses. It's often a complex problem driven by social norms, as was pointed out, and I completely agree. I think that's an incredibly interesting area of research and a very complicated. The more you look into it, the more it suggests complexity, because in a way, the more that you talk about corruption, if people begin to perceive it as something that is normal, that is every day, then that can influence their behavior as well. So part of the challenge is to recognize, also, as I think first speaker said, that not everyone is corrupt, and draw attention to those that do act with integrity and do act with countries and citizens' best interest, and draw inspiration from that, while also trying to build those institutions of accountability. But thanks again. I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Great. So thanks to each of you for sharing your initial contributions. We're doing great on time, and we have about 8 to 10 questions, I believe, in the from the audience that I see. I'm going to do something a bit novel. I'm going to go through each of the questions, and I'll indicate who I'd like to answer them, so we're able to supply full coverage. I also have a number of questions, but I will ask mine in the midst. The last question, I want to start with that. That comes with, well, just to indicate who I'd like to answer that. That comes, that focuses on an area that is really core to what this conference is about, which is the educational piece. It is how can educational systems begin the process of changing these drivers? And what I'd like to ask Dr. Coteau to think about, because I'm going to come to you about this question. What are we learning from our history, the historical drivers, the context of looking at models from outside the region and within the region to be able to develop mechanisms, tools, and systems that can really work for us and to educate our own people in the Caribbean? What are we learning from that? There are two questions that I have for from the audience questions as well for Dr. Munroe. I'd actually to prepare for that. One has to do with the idea that there are a number of standards, FCPA, SABS, UK Bribery Act, Dodd-Frank, and other frameworks that we see have issues with corruption. And the question is, beyond standards and legislation, what other measures can we use to address corruption? That's one. And then continuing from that question, what competencies are needed to develop and strengthen systems? I think this is an area that you have a lot to say and contribute, that have contributed a lot to as well. And I'd like to cue you up about that question, because I think it leans into the point you made earlier about legislative frameworks. The questions that I'd like to start with for Dr. Newman as well as Mr. Anderson has to do, there are two questions that are pretty similar. The first question that was asked today: what actions can regional and international lending agencies like the World Bank and CDB, ECCB, etc., do to promote reporting of corruption during project implementation by citizens? And before I finish that, because I'd like you to deal with these two questions together, that question, James and Darran, together with this issue of to what extent banks, I just lost it for a minute. But the question was, what can banks do? What can institutions do? And I get the sense they're talking about public institutions that deal with public funds, as well as private institutions that deal with private funds. But let's start with the first question, Dr. Newman, to you first and then to James. What can regional and international lending agencies that deal with public funds do to promote reporting and implementation by citizens of anti-corruption measures to dampen the drivers?
All right, thank you. And did you say specifically in projects that are supported by development
during project? Yes.
Okay.
That was the question from the audience.
I think fundamental is for any project that you're designing and developing, you should be doing it in ensuring that there is a wide stakeholder engagement. So citizens who are going to be directly impacted by the projects in activities should be engaged very early. So it's important for us as MDBs and other and multilateral development banks, bilaterals, other development partners, governments must ensure that engagement and that rapport happens very early and continues through a project. Now, I know some projects are remote and you probably can't engage with, but you need to set those fundamental mechanisms at the outset. People should be comfortable and have channels through which they can communicate and know whom to communicate on specific issues. Whistleblowing protection mechanisms might be also quite pertinent, might be quite important in some respects. But when you design, and you have to think about the interests, the impacts on different stakeholders. And we are in the business of specifically changing lives, transforming lives. So we are talking about citizens. We're talking about men, women, girls, boys, people of all ages. And we have to ensure that there are safeguards in place, that their interests are protected, and that we have the mechanisms. I think, as I said, stakeholder engagement, but also communication. They need to understand where where they can provide information on what is affecting them directly. But I mean, that's not always the case. But we do ensure that we have safeguards and these things in place for that kind of engagement is very important. Whatever you're doing as in part of your project preparation and design, you're supposed to have these toolkits. And as we go along, we do enhance, improve on these to ensure that as we go, we're learning and that we are doing no harm. I hope that's useful.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. I found the other question that was asked particularly to you, It said, you said the corruption can be mitigated, and the question was, do you think banks have a major role in elevating the socioeconomic status of masses and providing sustainable futures, as well as cutting the red tape that leads to corruption? And this is the question I would like to pose to James, because last year the World Bank completed a significant study on governance and looking globally at corruption, using case examples and typologies from around the world. I think there are many lessons in there for the Caribbean in terms of drivers, etc. But red tape, we have identified earlier, I believe, from as early as Professor Munroe's contribution. Red tape, directly or indirectly, obfuscation of legislative frameworks and access for the individual can be a significant driver. But James, to what extent do you see that as a driver, and what role can institutions like yours, the World Bank and CDB, play in being able to treat with that? I think that was what the audience member is asking.
Sure, thanks, and it's an excellent question. We often say when we talk about what can be done to reduce corruption, of course, we have people in the governance, global practice, who work on this, and we pay attention to systems of accountability, et cetera. But it's also a matter of looking in great detail at particular types of corruption and the whole what we call the process flow. Some people call it value chain of transactions or interactions between people or firms and the government official or clerk, and looking in detail at the different steps that have to be undertaken, et cetera, as a source of one type of corruption, which is what you might encounter when dealing with those with that red tape, and it can be very helpful for finding ways to streamline, finding ways to add transparency to the process, so that it's less likely for there to be some sort of holdup. But certainly the incentive to make things go slower in some places is something we hear about a lot. Streamlining, so streamlining can be done by reducing the steps, reducing the regulations, one-stop shops, et cetera. Technology is also a very positive potential contributor here by making more systems automated. It not only reduces some of the opportunities for that specific type of corruption, but also provides a clearer digital trail of what's going on, allows you to monitor a little bit better how long things take, and that's a big positive thing, is streamlining the business processes. Now, I should say also that sometimes some of the steps have some purpose. So I think it shouldn't be taken as a sort of a mantra to cut everything out, but to take a careful look at what sort of a purpose there is for something. I mean, it could be environmental protection or occupational safety protection. All sorts of regulations have some public purpose, and being sure that you achieve that public purpose in an efficient way and an honest way is the goal.
Thank you very much. And in answering that question, you also answered another question from the audience that had to do with the role of AI and modern technological solutions. So thank you for looking as well at automation and digitalization. There's another question about time conditionalities. I'll come back to yourself and Dr. Newman about after we get answers from Professor Munroe and Dr. Coteau. Professor Munroe, I'd like to come to you on the question from the audience about the legislation and the effectiveness of legislative frameworks, and then looking beyond that, and also the implications of other arms, judicial, prosecutorial, etc., and the role that they play in being able to dampen drivers of corruption.
Well, I think that legislation is a necessary but insufficient condition to come to grips better with.
I believe we lost Dr. Munroe there temporarily while the team works to get him back. I'd like to go directly to Dr. Coteau. So I mentioned earlier in my queue up that I'd be asking you about the impact of the educational systems, the question from the audience, as well as what are we learning from our history in relation to being able to design solutions that are Caribbean specific and that are attuned to our culture and our sociological experience. There's also another question from the audience for you, Dr. Coteau, so I'd like you to take them in tandem. And it's to what extent does the nature of the electoral system and the cost of campaign financing and pressure on politicians to maintain power contribute to corruption? So that's a political angle. But I'd like to ask you if you can touch on that, the education, the design, and the political angle.
Okay, so I think as I think we would all agree, the education is critical here. And one of the things in regards to if we are to meaningfully address corruption within the Caribbean basin, we do have to look at, a more comprehensive education awareness mainstream campaign. And I deliberately say mainstream because when I talk about mainstream, I mean it has to start with our youth within the educational system. And outside of that, we have our civil society has a responsibility to continue the awareness on, the impact and consequences of corruption. And I deliberately say this is because one of the reasons I say this is because we cannot, it's inexcusable for corruption. It's a taboo anyway, as Dr. Newman rightly pointed out earlier, but we cannot just in the Caribbean basin, celebrate, anti-corruption initiatives 1 week or 1 day throughout the year and expect that to be acceptable with a view to making a meaningful difference and meaningful impacts. We have to really be a lot more bolder, and we have to also be honest and truthful to ourselves about, the roots of corruption and the realities within our within the respective Caribbean countries. One of the issues, therefore, is the issue of the cultural tolerances of corruption. If we talk about education per se, in regards to assisting to address corruption, which I agree is fundamental, but we cannot just the starting point cannot just be where one's positionality in regards to the various indices. We have to go back and understand why it exists, what we are doing, why it exists, what are some of the nuances as to why it exists. The histories I've already spoken about, but indeed why it currently exists, continues to exist today, irrespective of the legislation that the various countries may have enacted, the issues regarding the lack of resources to then enforce the legislation. All of these are issues that, have to be addressed and needs to be addressed through an educational platform. And why I say that, though the educational platform isn't a singular platform, but it's a combination, and the conversation and the education and edifying our people has to be ongoing. That is absolutely critical. We talk and going, if I can just then, continue on to that question that's been asked in regards to corruption and campaign financing. Again, of course, there is when you look at the Caribbean basins and you look at the economics, the current economic position where the Caribbean countries sit economically currently, we can understand. Where some of the challenges that we have. But at the end of the day, one of the issues that we have to recognize is that, campaign financing is crucial for our politicians, to get the votes to cross the line. This is a reality. This is reality that it's not just about, we understand that it happens, but why does it happen? What are the consequences? What are the implications? And again, so why I raise this is because the education behind the drivers behind corruption, it has to be an ongoing conversation. You know, it has to be
Yes.
ongoing. It cannot be a stop-start, because I think that is the approach that, you know, in the Caribbean we have taken. It's very bite-sized at convenient times when it suits. That is not going to get us. That is not going to get us the changes that is
we need.
required. You know, we will remain with the status quo. We really have to be a bit bold, you know, in regards to looking at some of the bigger pictures around how the issues of corruption needs to be addressed more meaningfully.
Thank you very much. And I think that is a key, that actually is a rationale or a driver for 3Cs conference as a whole, which is to ensure that we have continuing education. I mentioned right to the top that a number of the members of the audience are youth and students. And we even have a panel on youth and corruption tomorrow, women and corruption. But I see that Professor Munroe has rejoined us, and I'd like to ask him to continue his answer. And there is also another question for you in the chat, Professor Munroe. I'd like to ask you to treat with that before we go to our final 5 minutes wrap. And it is, do you believe corruption has a lot to do with how well the system functions? I think here the question is around, you know, inefficiencies in the system and market failure. And if basic necessities become easy to attain, neither the provider nor the consumer are tempted to participate in corruption. So if you can touch on both the legislative framework issue you were answering first, as well as that question, whether or not it has to do with how well the system functions, we'd be very grateful. Please go, Professor.
I wish we had more time, and apologies for leaving you for a few minutes, because I wanted to start off where our last panelist left, if I may. Education, sure. Fundamental, building citizen awareness, and starting with the young people at the same time as you address adults. National Integrity Action, which is Jamaica's chapter of Transparency International, which I have the privilege of leading, has some considerable experience in this in terms of building public awareness. And we are seeing results. A 2017 survey of Jamaican young people between the ages of 10 and 19 sought to identify the extent to which they understood the difference between right and wrong, between that which is corrupt and that which is of practice of integrity. And surprising to many, the young people were very, very well aware of the difference. In fact, some of the questions were surprising even to myself. They were asked, for example, whether a very poor person with very little means of survival could steal electricity to keep hand and body together. 80% said it's wrong. But, and here's the link with the overall system. When they were asked to what extent would they report acts of corruption, the percentage fell dramatically. The main reason, nothing would happen. Mm-hmm. And that links with the overall system, the lack of accountability. You can't teach the young people crime and corruption does not pay. If those who are looking around in their communities see persons who are allegedly good evidence involved in crime and at the top of the society, ministers and members of boards, Auditor General's reports indicating hundreds of millions of dollars wastefully or corruptly spent, and nothing happens except resignation, you are going to be going up a hill to teach. And therefore, the issue of re-socializing the attitudes of the young needs to, at the same time, tackle meaningful accountability through legislation and, even more important, enforcement of the legislation. That leads to issues like campaign finance, which is crucial. The Jamaican legislator led the way in the Caribbean on that. He passed campaign finance legislation effective in 2017 after 15 years of campaigning. And that's a lesson we need to learn. Yeah. We're not going to get the significant legislative changes, nor law enforcement, without sustained advocacy, activism, and public education. But when you do get the law, the question of enforcement comes around. The question of improving, of closing the loopholes. In this case, the disclosure of who gives what to which party or which candidate is disclosed to the Electoral Commission. The public remains in the dark. That is a loophole, like so many others, that need to be closed and can be closed. The legislation which I spoke about in my introductory remarks, going before the Parliament of Jamaica today, to reduce the extent of politicization of public boards, could not have happened without systematic campaigning on the part of NIA, members of the private sector, civil society organization, and persons within the political directorate who stand for integrity against those who do not. And this leads to the issue of civil society organizations. I want to perhaps be provocative and ask whether members of the panel or others believe that sufficient practical, putting your money where your mouth is being paid to civil society. We heard all of this important talk about the importance of civil society engaged in citizenry, holding the leadership to account, challenging impunity. But do the international financial institutions, do regional organizations like the CDB, do they have a window for supporting civil society organizations involved in good governance, involved in the struggle against misspending of money and corruption? Do they have a window? If they do not, then how can they expect that the targets which are appropriately set, sometimes miscalled the conditionalities, that these are going to be met without systematic advocacy outside of the established legislative and governance framework? And I refer to this simple example again. 2019, the International Monetary Fund says a part of Jamaica's issue in not coming to grips with corruption is the politicization of the appointment of public boards. If it were not advocacy outside of the governmental institution, then we would not have the legislation going to Parliament today.
Well, I'm very happy to see that at least Jamaica has developed a solution after many years of hard work by civil society that can be an example to the rest of the region. And that is what this conference is about. It's about exploring and lifting those new ideas, looking at global insights and bringing them to bear. And I think earlier Dr. Newman mentioned tolerance, trivialization, and taboo, but there's another big T in the room, which is trust as well. And how do we build public trust and integrity through civic education and awareness, and how do we do that well? The earlier question about conditionalities in the loans of and grants provided by international institutions, I'll ask Dr. Newman and James to touch on that in their wrap up, which I'm going to ask each of you to do now. But I'd also like to mention two things before I go there, which is one, members of the audience may have also heard us talk about some things like detection mechanisms, whistleblower policies as well, and frameworks, as well as some prevention aspects. We didn't focus so much on those, but I'm glad that you were able to hear them come through from the contributions from members of the panel. I'd like to ask each of you, beginning with Dr. Newman, to just give us what are your three key takeaways in your last few minutes, as we have the last few minutes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Boyce. I'm going to pick up on some of the issues that others spoke about. And one of the things that came up was, what are we going to do as development agencies? I think that came up in terms of the socioeconomic, the masses, and making sure that we are mitigating corruption. Well, we need to have very, very clear good governance principles, which are reflected in our actions, in our policies, in our practices. Most importantly, in engaging with the leaders across our region too. We do have relationships with different stakeholders, and I don't want to go back into the citizen-led action. It's absolutely critical, and Professor Munroe articulated it very, very well. More needs to be done on the social accountability side, but I would also want to reiterate leadership. The leaders, we need to see model behavior, because for change to occur, people need to see that there is some interest in change being demonstrated, and we conform. I conform because I know what you expect me to do, and I'm looking to think, well, that's what's expected of me as part of the group. But you need to have leaders, you need to have persons that will stand out, and we need to have them very visibly in their accountability roles as part of community of practice. So I would say consensus building with those leaders and civil society actors at the forefront, changing the language around corruption, openly speaking about it, making it, dispelling it, it's no longer taking it on, countering it is not a taboo issue. It is about equality, it's about justice, and it's about doing the right thing at the end of the day. So we need to play a role in nurturing those communities of practices, to play a role in promoting that. There is evidence that shows that collective coordinated responses can lead to changes in behavior. And so I think going forward, that social norms approach should be part of the package of interventions, along with the rules-based interventions, which have been mentioned. I won't go into them, the anti-corruption law, the civil society, the social, the transparency, the enforcement. All of those are their multi-leveled entry points, but we cannot leave out the behavioral change, and we need to pull the leaders and others together and model the behavior. And this is long-term work. It is complex, as James said, and there is some research. It is very difficult to change behaviors, but it is possible. So I just wanted to put that down as one of the very key areas. We have been engaging with over 70 members of parliament in the last 3 months on areas of legislative oversight. We hope to have continued discussion with this key group, because the research shows in other parts of the world that greater control over legislative oversight, you see less levels of corruption. So if we could use that as an example of an entry point where you work with a community of practice to help in terms of moving in that direction, and us as a region having a open conversation, discourse on corruption and shared understanding of it, because it has different looks and it has different complexions here and there. So that's really my main point. I know there's more I could say on this, but I hope that helps in terms of prevention and methods in terms of introducing the social norms as a driver. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Social norms, prevention, methods. Thank you very much for your contributions, Dr. Darran Newman. By the way, you mentioned engaging with the national governance and integrity platforms in countries. You mean the Caribbean Development Bank. And James, you as lead governance specialist at the World Bank also have a similar mandate. So tell us, what are your key takeaways for the audience from this panel? What are your key takeaways?
Okay, well, thanks. But before I get to the key takeaways, there were a couple of outstanding questions on our work with civil society, conditionality, et cetera. On the question on civil society, I think it's an excellent and very important question. Just to let you know very briefly some of the things we do. So on the one hand, I think part of what we do is to try to empower civil society through things like access to information, open government, policies and systems, and try to bring about that shift to make more information available, opportunity for participation in legislative review, including at very local level, et cetera. That's part of it. We have something else called the Global Partnership on Social Accountability, which provides more direct support for certain civil society led activities that they apply for a grant. We have a system of citizen engagement, both as a goal, a development goal, also something that is inherently built in to a lot of our projects. And I think that this was mentioned earlier on the part of the Korean Development Bank, where we have, on the one hand, try to build in that active engagement throughout a project, but also create a mechanism, and every project has to have a mechanism for people to report grievances. And those grievances can be of all different sorts. It could be allegations of corruption. It could also be allegations of mistreatment or a violation of product rules, or just poor quality. So all of those things have to be received and looked into. And of course, all of our projects require that every bidder on, for example, a procurement has to agree to the World Bank's anti-corruption guidelines, which imposes on them certain commitments, both about their behavior, but also about the commitment to share information and cooperate with investigations if there should be any accusation, etc.
Right.
Key takeaways. Sorry, that went on too long.
Yes, because we're out of time, but I just wanted to ensure that we're responsive. Go right ahead.
Key takeaways. A lot of momentum, and it's important not to lose this momentum. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. I wanted to say that we have a panel on civil society tomorrow, so I was just going to ask that we also ask the audience to tune in for that. That's going to be very exciting as well. Civil society and the media and their role in combating corruption. Dr. Coteau, please tell us, what are your key takeaways? We're out of time, but we're just going to
Okay, so key takeaways for me is obviously understanding some of those cultural tolerances and nuances, I think, is fundamentally important. Really, I think we can talk about legislation, as all day long, but I think the issue is we have legislation. It's about the resources to enforce and the discussions and the confidence within governments and societal systems to actually enforce. I think that's critical. And then I think also it's about recognizing that there is a need for our indices, I think, from where I'm coming from, to really be looked at least to factor in some of those historical and cultural nuances. Caribbean Basin.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Professor Munroe, please, your key takeaways.
Rebuilding trust and confidence at all levels can only be done by practicing what we preach. That applies as much to politicians who make promises in every single election in the region as to how much they're going to combat corruption. It applies to civil society organizations to practice what they preach. It applies to the Caribbean Development Bank and the World Bank, who are in pivotal roles. Concrete example I end with. Much aid and assistance has come to the region, to Jamaica, in respect of combating the COVID pandemic. 1.5 years ago, Jamaica ceased to publish, as it did before, quarterly contract awards. As we speak, I cannot go on the website of the Integrity Commission and see which company got what funds to do what. This is a matter that the regional institutions and international institutions who provide funding need to pay attention to. The citizenry must be aware. There must be full transparency in respect of aid and grants so that they can be confident that the money is going to where it should, rebuilding educational institutions, as well as services provided to the citizenry. One good thing I would refer to before I leave, and that is the innovation within the last 2 years in Jamaica of a public investment map, whereby any citizen can go online to see which project is happening where. Once it's funded, I think the IDB is the key here, and can determine online what is the extent of completion against the extent of targets, and which are the contractors responsible. That is a good example of what can and should be done across the board. Building the systems of accountability, ensuring that they are transparent, and that those who have the authority do so in an accountable manner, practice what we preach.
Thank you very much. So there were about 10 additional questions in the chat for us that we couldn't get to, unfortunately. But I'd like to thank each of you for your sterling contributions to this conference and to this panel in particular. I think the thrust of this conference is to educate and elevate thought leadership in the region, and you have delivered exactly that. You've also given some very key and core takeaways and lessons to our audience. We are having panels tomorrow on COVID and corruption and managing promoting governance through uncertain times, the keynote discussion. So I encourage our audience members to do that. And I'd like to end by thanking the audience that we have of now close to 1,000 or maybe over 1,000 registered attendees from all over the world, from 45 different countries. Thank you for your time and attention. And I hope that you've learned a lot from what we've just provided to you. And thank you for joining us at 3Cs2021. All the very best.
And thank you for having us. We really
Thank you.
appreciate this.